And we're live with Jeff and Bradley, who looks like he's in the shower, so watch out for psycho attackers. Over to Jeff for the introduction.
All right, so this is Homicide: Life on the Street, Season 7, Episode 7, which is called Wanted Dead or Alive, Part 2, and it originally aired November 20th, 1998 on NBC, was written by Anya Epstein and directed by Robert Harmon, so same director as last week, but different writer credited. And I'll read a couple of brief recaps and then see what the others have to say. Lewis and the injured woman are rushed to the hospital, and Johnson is rearrested. Mike insists on taking responsibility for the accident even after the woman dies, and her husband files a wrongful death suit against the department. Once Noel and Mike work with Falzone to discover that the original fugitive has fled to Miami, the two of them head south with Bayless to bring him back. The resolution of the cases leaves a bad taste in everyone's mouth, though. As Gardy's wife files for divorce, he decides to spend all the money he can in order to keep her from getting any of it in the settlement. Okay, and TV.com's recap says, Lewis is transported to the hospital, as is the passenger of the car that Mike hit. Gardy is worked up about women and finances because he and Flora and their lawyers are going to be working out the financial details of their divorce. G and Mike are not interested in cooperating with the bounty hunters. However, Noel is the only one who can get any information on the whereabouts of Erico from Erico's mother. She has promised to page Noel when her son calls. Joe Erico has gone south to Miami. Noel offers to pay the expenses of having the homicide detectives go to Miami and work with him, but G declines that offer and sends his detectives separately. In Miami, Bayless and Mike work with Noel to capture Erico. Noel offers to split the huge bounty with the homicide detectives, which they refuse. Mike decides that the best use for the bounty might be for the man whose wife had died from the injuries she sustained in the car accident. Lewis also calls that man who isn't interested in hearing his apologies. So that's a brief summary there. Ben, what'd you think? I just looked at your your photo, right?
Yeah.
It was like, besides the cleavage, what'd you think?
Yeah. Besides very nice, what do I think? Okay. Right. So I created a little list, and what I'll do is I'll stop the automatic playback to avoid some distractions. Bring the distractions when necessary. So I like the history of the. I moved my microphone a little bit closer to the old lips. So does that sound better, Jeff?
Yeah.
Right. So I when he like showed that and other bits of evidence that he's learned. The guy, the ESTP bounty hunter, and also more evidence for his, ESTP preferences. And I liked how when he talked about the history of the bounty hunters, I liked there was good acting from the actor playing Junior G. He didn't overdo it, but and the parts was well written for him. I don't know what it was about the actor, but it was just something in the first episode where I just thought he was, ever since like the second episode he was in, he just seemed. I think maybe it's because I was directly comparing him to Pemberton. But he's a good actor. He's never really hit any false notes at all. So I'm pleased with him as an actor. I thought the guest actor was okay. What did you think of the acting, Jeff? And then I'll get back to my points.
Well, I mean, my biggest judge of acting is always, was there any moments where I was like taken out of the story and thinking about them as actors because they're not convincing, and there wasn't anything like that for me. So I mean, there wasn't anything in this particular episode that I took note of, like, oh, that was especially great acting, but there wasn't anything I thought wasn't good. So
yeah,
just stayed in the story.
Yeah. So you have quite a lot of experience with ESTPs. How good a job did you think the actor did at portraying the ESTP?
Good. Well, yeah. I mean, he's really good, and I guess the main thing that I think of because, of course, he went on to be for many years on Law and Order SVU, and so seeing him in this, what I kept thinking was that he did a good job in that. That's really the main two things I've seen him in, and there's very distinctive differences between the characters. Like this character and the one he plays on SVU don't seem that similar. So I thought, obviously, if nothing else, he definitely established a separate character in that. And of course, this was before he played the SVU character, but on that show, he was one of the main stars of the show, so he's a regular cast member as opposed to this, doing 2 episodes. But obviously, he still seemed very believable in the character and established everything you needed to know about the guy from his short stint on the show, I think. So that's Christopher Maloney that we're talking about.
Right, and so these were the guest people in the show. As Jeff said there, Christopher Maloney, Steve Ryan, Walt McPherson, who's this guy here. This guy is Danvers. And we've got Anya Epstein, the writer. Right. So we've got good acting from Junior G, and then I've also put good anatomical shots too. And here he is appreciating the anatomical shots.
Yeah, as we were watching this, because he had complained earlier that he hadn't seen any breasts, and as soon as that scene pops up, Morgan goes, "There they are."
Yeah, and implants as well, especially in this example.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's what he said he was looking for. So.
Yes, exactly. That's what Miami's all about. If you want to see more of that, folks, tune in to Nip Tuck. So we got. I thought it handled, and then I've written stuff about on a serious note, where we got all of the stuff about, he played it well. It was like underplayed. He didn't overact it. It was real. They wrote the character's reaction well. There's I can imagine lots of other actors who have taken acting choices that would have still been real, but where they would have played it a little bit stronger. The inner conflict of having caused this injury, and it sort of brought up an issue for me, are car chases by the police worth it if people are going to get injured like this? And I'm wondering, what are the statistics on the number of people getting injured because of car chases, and have they just changed their policy now and just have the helicopter following them, and now they might even have drones?
Well, I don't know anything about changes of policy, but I can say that one of the things that real cops will continually say when they're asked about how realistic a particular cop show is that there's not nearly as many car chases in real police work. For the most part, I think they try, not for any policy changes, but have just tried to avoid it. That's been the policy, that they try to avoid getting into any situation where you're going to, be driving through areas where you're putting people at risk with that kind of driving. You're trying to avoid that if at all possible.
Yeah, and I suppose, SJs are 45% of people in the United States, and similar percentages around the world. And there's going to be a large percentage in the police as well, isn't there, Jeff? So, yeah, sure. And even if not that, the mentality of that is still going to be spread to those people, even if they're not SJs. And you've got the traditions as well to serve and to protect. What was I thinking about? Oh yeah, I did the helicopters thing. And then also you get these discussions of the practicality of when they said that the Baltimore Police Department has to pay insurance, in case they get sued in these things. And of course that means that they're paying heavy premiums because of these civil action suits. And so it just made me think, and then you've got the ethics of the fact that, and G did bring it up about the fact that where the guy who's getting scapegoated is the guy who was being chased by the police. even though it was actually a police officer that was actually the one that committed the act of manslaughter.
Mm-hmm.
And now, he did bring that up, Danvers, when he said, "Oh, there's case law to support this," but you could see the inner conflict within Junior G. So, and I did think, and I just
click on the next photo.
Okay.
Since you're talking about him.
Yep.
There you go.
There we go. I should put it on the autoplay.
Well, I was being the director this time since you were talking about him.
Yep. And that's when they just found out that Lewis is alive.
Yeah, they go right from Lewis is okay to the woman has died.
And of course, he has some really good reaction shots. This actor who plays Lewis, I've forgotten his name. Clark Johnson.
Clark Johnson, yeah.
He's not quite Nicholas Lyndhurst, but very few are. But he's pretty good with his reaction shots, and he'd be good in a sitcom. So, what do you think about that, Jeff? About the legal issues involved in this episode?
Well, anytime there's like legal wrangling where they're trying to like stretch something to prosecute somebody, it reminds me of Law and Order because they do that in practically every episode. I mean, McCoy, especially the DA, is always trying to find some way to stretch something to prosecute somebody who didn't actually directly cause someone's death. So it reminds me of that. They don't do it as much on Homicide, but you have these occasional episodes where it comes up because, of course, they don't focus on the lawyer aspect nearly as much. It's just sort of Danvers shows up from time to time as kind of a go-between.
Oh, I've written down a line on the sheet. Sorry if I talked over you there. I was going to say that I should have said here, Shannon Worry, eat your heart out, which is going to call back there to like previous reviews. Right. So then, Bradley, what do you think of the episode?
Yeah, I thought it was really well done. It's kind of hard to me to talk about this part 2 without having part 1 as a reference, but
we can talk about that as well because you've seen them together.
Oh yeah, well, I mean the development of the what's the bounty hunter's name?
The main guy.
Oh yeah, the main guy.
Noel.
Yeah.
No, okay. I thought they developed him really well, where everyone wasn't sure about how his ethics or his methods, and Christopher Maloney did a good job of making sure that you didn't know how to feel about him in the first didn't know how to feel about him in the first part, and in the second part it's kind of revealed his own personality is kind of he kind of explains himself, and we're allowed to see his methods and his knowledge about how the bounty hunter came, the first bounty hunters from the Tudors, and I thought that was really good. And then in the end, he tried to share his profits with all the team. Of course, they said they couldn't take it, and even in the end with G, he just literally left the money there and said, "Take it if you want. I'm leaving." That's something that you probably wouldn't have expected of his character from seeing the first part. And I thought, I also was comparing his performance to his SV performance, and the characters do seem incredibly different. And he did a good job of playing this character the way it needed to be played. So I enjoyed that most of all. I also liked they raised the sort of the responsibility of, and what am I calling what I'm trying to say, the responsibility of committing, killing a civilian in the process of chasing a criminal, and they did a really good job of the aftermath, and who loses the most. Everyone sort of feels responsible, except, and of course, a criminal who says, you know, I didn't do it, you did it. And yeah, I just thought it did a really good job of covering the ramifications of people's actions, but not overemphasizing it, because it was it's sort of it was in the, they did have that theme of well, I killed this person, I put her in the hospital, and now she's dead. That theme did kind of play out, but they did it in a good enough way to where it didn't impede on the actual plot line. So it was, you were still cognizant of it, but it didn't it didn't become a, you know, you're responsible plot line, but those issues were raised and they still were able to progress the story. The original story, they were able to progress that pretty well. So I guess those are my two biggest impressions. I'm still, I haven't seen that many two-parters of Homicide, and it was interesting to see the pacing, because when it's just a self-contained one episode storyline, the pacing seems to suit, you know, kind of, I don't remember the last time I participated in one of these hangouts, but the last time we were talking about how they did a good job of bouncing between their personal lives and the story, and they weren't overdoing like the forensics or the law part, and they did a good job of sort of balancing the actual police procedural part with the characterization and the character development, and then kind of do a sort of teeter-totter where they're balancing in between the story and the characters. And I think personally, I think it works better for a one episode story arc, to where you know, there's obviously the greater season, the seasonal plot, and then the episode plot. And I think it was sort of, to me, that there was sort of a disbalance between the way the two-part episode story was progressing with the usual banter of the characters. So when Ballad, I don't think Ballad was in the first part as well, right? She just came back in the second part.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. So sort of when Ballad sort of came back, and you know, they were talking about her relationship with his name escapes me.
Her partner or the guy she's interested in?
Yeah, the romantic, the guy she's interested in.
Okay, that's Falzone.
Falzone, that's right, Falzone. So yeah, I mean, they did talk to Falzone about their relationship, and in the first part, and then the second part, they sort of brought Ballad back in and talked about like her part in it. And I thought that was really good. You know, a good use of how to reintroduce a character who wasn't around, and then suddenly slip them back in as if it is one coherent season and story, because it is. But some of the other things, I'm trying to think of any specifics, but I can't. But a lot of the other things I felt sort of fell flat. And I use that very loosely, because it's just kind of a feeling I got from actually watching the episode, and I don't really have any concrete examples. It's sort of I think what I'm trying to say is that some of the bigger story points were since it was a two-part episode, some of the bigger story points were a bigger deal, and some of the lesser story points were, comparatively speaking, less of a deal. So it felt like that there was a sort of disconnect between like the bigger plot and like the really minor plot, like the divorce. So I don't know character names really well, but the divorce of Ballad's partner was sort of one of the things which is you know, relevant, but a lot less relevant than some of the other things. So I would usually like that sort of I'd usually like that sort of weaving in and out of character stories, but in terms of this plot, the 2 episode plot, it felt a little bit unbalanced. Is what I'm trying to say.
I've talked quite a few times in the past, Ben can testify to, about how I think when you write multi-part stories, it's easier to set things up than it is to conclude them.
Right.
And I feel that this was another example of that, where to me I did feel like the resolution was kind of a letdown in terms of the interesting parts of it. Not that it was unrealistic, because I'm sure the way this concluded, could happen. I liked the fact that they didn't make things easy with the car accident.
Mm-hmm.
Even though Lewis survived, the woman didn't, and there was, I thought, the suspense of that, and was, maybe they could have had Lewis's, being unconscious longer, maybe give a little bit more suspense in that. But overall, I didn't have a problem with that. But the way that they sort of resolved catching the guy in Florida, all that just seemed like sort of a, I don't know, not distraction, not the right word, but just sort of it didn't seem, I didn't get much out of it. Let's put it that way. The Adventures in Miami wasn't really that interesting to me, and the detective that they were with in Florida seemed like, again, I don't think bad acting. I just think the character wasn't interesting, and he didn't seem like he was that, into it. So again, probably realistic in that there's a lot of detectives that are not like exciting people,
Right.
but there wasn't anything that struck me as that, there wasn't very much compelling about those scenes. Them arguing over who had the superior crabs and stuff. But I did like the little discussion, and it probably didn't mean as much to you, Bradley, since you haven't seen the earlier seasons, but when they had the discussion about all the people in the squad room that had either been shot or injured or hospitalized in some way. So we got sort of name drops of some characters that were previously on the show but aren't around anymore. So I liked that. But I couldn't help but just feel like overall the setup was much better than the conclusion. It's just sort of the way I felt about it. There wasn't anything that stuck out as, oh, this scene was bad, or this was, it was just, it didn't have the intensity that the first part did. And I think, again, that's sort of natural when you have a conclusion, that it's, it's easier to kind of end on suspense and cliffhanger type thing, and then have the second part. You're not that everything is resolved, but you're trying to resolve sort of the main basic story, and it kind of fizzles out a bit. And I kind of feel that way about it. So that's just sort of my overall feeling, but there wasn't any particular thing that I could point to and say, well, this was a problem in the episode. It just overall wasn't super compelling to me.
Jeff, I don't know if we were on air at the time, but I think that Morgan said something interesting when he said that for him, he would find it easier to conclude a story than to create the start of a story.
Yeah, so obviously he and I need to write together. And he writes the conclusions and I write the setup, because even when I was a kid, I remember there was, I don't know if either of you had this, but I know it's a pretty common thing in my schooling, is where they would try to teach something, whether it was vocabulary, words, or concepts, or whatever they were trying to teach, by having you write a story using either certain words or a certain theme, or things like that, to try to make it kind of something that you could be interesting, but you're trying to like use certain things so that you're reminded of those. And even in like geometry, I remember that there was a time where she basically said there was certain geometry vocabulary words that she wanted us to learn, and so wanted to write a story using those words. And I wrote like a sci-fi story called Captain Scalene and His Adventures in the Pythagorean Quadrant, or something like that, But the entire, it was basically sort of like, a comic strip kind of story, where it ends on a cliffhanger, where like everything is like set up and there's no conclusion. But it's because I didn't have to do a conclusion. It was just a writing assignment for this length and putting these words in. Then it was easy for me to write, because all I had to do was like find ways to like make it dramatic, and then I didn't have to come up with an ending. So, but if I ever did have to come up with an ending, I guess I'd have to get Morgan to help with that.
I wonder.
Things easier.
You know, as is my want to maybe like, you know, the way abstract types are, they get a bit more abstract, and they might like try to use functions more, like ascribe things to functions. So I would think, so when Morgan said that he found the ending, he would find that easier than starting it. That sort of made me think, oh, I wonder if that has much to do with TI or reasoning, in that ESTPs generally find reasoning easier. So it's like what are the logical consequences of what could happen once you've got this situation unfolding.
I find drama easier.
Mm.
When I read that picture that was put in the chat thing earlier, I was like, the only one that really jumped out at me was passion, because I said I'm a very passionate person. So if I did that on both of those, passion, it equaled the one that said the drama. So I'm like, yeah, there you go. But yeah, so I mean, I feel like maybe it is more like it's more of an emotional thing, suspense, because you're trying to like get people excited. You know, you're trying to make an impact in a way that people want to tune in and see what happens next. And I've discussed this with Morgan before. That's why I like, you know, soap opera type, the kind of story, because it combines the two things that the most appeal to me, both emotional connections between people and that kind of like suspense, you know, always ending on a cliffhanger kind of rating that I like.
So because Bradley wasn't around, I don't think Bradley was around in the previous review. Have you got anything you'd like to say, Bradley, about part one?
I might have to think for a few seconds.
Okay.
Well, I will say that I really enjoyed seeing Falzone as I don't think I've ever seen him be the lead detective on a case. I don't think I've ever seen it, so that was really nice to see. I'm really happy when he's in it, because it gives lots of contrast to all of the SJ dominance. So it's really nice to see him, you know, being playing the responsible guy, as opposed to having all the SJs look at him and be like, "You're ridiculous." So it was a nice contrast to me to see him in that, you know, a normal police role.
That's funny because, you know, a lot of the fans of Homicide, you know, that I spread their opinions on the internet back when the show first aired, they couldn't stand him and thought that he was used way too much. So it's funny. It's good, actually, though, to hear your perspective from not seeing that much of it, that, you know, looking at it that way, because it is a fresh perspective on, you know, as opposed to watching the whole show up until before he's on the show and then him coming in. And so you have a different attitude about him as a character, as opposed to longtime fans who kind of viewed him as like, who's this punk who comes in and acts like he runs the place, kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
But I never disliked him as much as a lot of people did. But I do think that there were some stories where I would have maybe focused on someone else a little bit more, but it wasn't. I thought he was still, you know, a decent character, and there's certain episodes where he's used very well. There was one from season 6 where he has this, you know, he's basically talking to a child who was the only witness to the murder of his parents, and so he's trying to sort of, you know, get into the child's world and be his friend, but also learn from him. So I thought he was well used in that. And there's an episode coming up later in this season where it kind of takes advantage of some of his, like, the Italian culture that he comes from in terms of him solving a crime. So there were certain episodes where I thought, he was will think that there were certain other characters I would have focused on a little bit more. So I'm kind of in the middle on that one.
I do have a kind of a follow-up question to that. Could you how was your reaction to Falzone when they added him to the show? Because I just kind of assumed he was there from the beginning, but I haven't seen any of the early season. So what was your do you think he was I can see how it could have been extremely obnoxious if it's just a new season, new guy, and he's just in there being an SB.
I would suggest going back and watching, of course, the previous seasons and seeing how that all developed, because he actually came at the end of a season rather than the beginning, and it sort of was was probably not intended to be, when he first arrived, a long-term character, because in the way he showed up, they kind of made him sort of over the top, obnoxious, kind of slimy type of guy, because I don't think they may not have thought of him as being a full-time character, and it sort of fit in the particular story that he was brought in. But then after that, I think they said, well, we need to develop him and kind of figure out, where does he come from? Because he can't just be, it can't just be somebody who irritates everybody. But, there's got to be some redeeming qualities for him. And so and I think Homicide, I said this to my son, why I showed him the episodes in the first place, because we had a discussion where he said that he really liked character development. And I said, of the few shows that I thought of right off the bat, when somebody says they like character development, Homicide is one of those that immediately springs to mind. And so I thought they did a good job of delving into his character and showing, what makes him tick and the different sides of him. And like I said, some of the fans, the longtime fans at the time, thought too much, that they spent too much time on him. But I think there was some network pressure, which Ben and I have talked about in some previous things, on certain things. And one of them was they wanted to try to get, more viewers in various ways. And one of them was to have what they thought was a more attractive cast. And so they thought, that he was an actor, had a certain look that could attract people visually, I think. So, same reason that, they brought a couple of new female characters on in the last couple of seasons also, because Ballard and Shepard are also weren't at the beginning of the show. So some people, it was sort of part of a larger thing that they sort of was a detriment to in the last couple of seasons, where they, or as the show went on, that they focused too much on the image and less on being a realistic police department. But I always view it as, do I buy the character and the situation and the story? Does it make sense? Does it, it doesn't have to be 100% realistic. I prefer it when it's more that way, but of course I don't know, I've never been a homicide detective myself. So obviously I can't say every single thing, whether or not this rings true to me. So it's more like, as an audience member watching this, is there anything that sort of sticks out as me thinking, oh, come on, that wouldn't happen? And when you weren't here for last week's, the one thing that I said was like that in the first part of this story was where the bounty hunter, PJ, that went to jail, that they were kind of trying to threaten him, like, some of those guys in there are going to remember you, that you maybe were the one that brought them in. And then they have that scene where it's like somebody does immediately recognize him, and there's people calling out to him like they're going to get, I thought, well, that's a little over the top. That one element seemed like it's a little bit unrealistic that it would happen that way. That's just my opinion, maybe. And somebody could tell me, who was a real cop, no, this exact thing happened. And I'd be like, okay, I can't that's how it strikes me. So it's all about perception, in terms of, does this seem like it works? And as far as getting back to the character of Falzone, everything they did with his character rang pretty true. I never was like, oh, this is wildly out of character for him or something. And I thought it was funny, Ben and I have talked about this before too, that, in our perspective of sort of evaluating it from a Myers-Briggs standpoint, that it's funny when you hear the characters sort of assess each other's personalities, the times that they're sort of spot on in their assessments, and other times where they're way off. Because it's funny, because it reminds us that not everybody is as good at assessing people. and sometimes you have people who totally misunderstand the motivations of someone. They just assume, and it tends to be what David Kersey says, people tend to assume other people are like them, that they think like them. So if they act in a certain way, they think, if I acted that way, this would be why, so that's why it is for this person, even though it could be a totally different motivation. So I know that's all kind of vague, but that we've seen evidence of that in Falzone in terms of the way other people have sized him up, in terms of what they've sort of figured he was trying to do in some of the things he did. And it's funny, in the previous season, when you had a lot of conflict between Falzone and Kellerman, that they're pretty similar personality-wise, but they had this big conflict, and they didn't see each other as being that similar. They both thought of the other one as being this other thing that they're not. And, same thing kind of happened with Pimbleton and Kellerman. So, yeah, I think with the SP characters on the show, you have sort of a certain amount of that rivalry that springs up, where they want to be unique in their own, and they kind of see everybody else as being something different, and they don't want to associate, oh, I'm not like that guy, and when a lot of times they are a lot more similar than they would want to admit.
Mm-hmm. You'll see a bit more of. Is Kellerman coming in next episode, Jeff?
I wasn't going to talk about that until we actually got to the end, but I don't know if there's anything either one of you want to say more about this episode before we rate it.
Oh yeah, I'll ask you. You said there, Morgan. Why does Morgan like character development?
Why does he like character? I don't know specifically. I mean, he may have said back when we had that discussion, but that was a while ago, so I don't remember exactly. Because obviously we have somewhat different perceptions of what that is. Because I know we talked about it again recently, where certain shows that I like that he doesn't.
I can imagine some people saying something, not liking it when characters change.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's as much about changing per se as I think development. I think if it's that kind of depends on the circumstance. But if there isn't some kind of big trauma or event that occurs in a character's life, then it's almost like it's harder because you're developing, but you're doing it much slower, and realistically, you're not trying to have a character change. I can think of some examples of the opposite where characters were plot conveniences, and so their personalities changed all the time because they were totally inconsistent. Something we talked about sometimes before is some of the Doctor Who companions. There was one that they called Dodo from way back in the first Doctor era, who, her personality seemed to change every story because it was like the writers of those stories were not the same. They were writing that, and they were just sort of using her as companion X. Yeah. Just sort of this generic companion character, and not ever really factoring in anything she'd experienced before or how she acted in the previous stories. So I don't think it was the fault of the actress. I think they just wrote her totally inconsistently. And you have, some other examples of that too. So I think it's tough when you have a show where you have different writers over time. You have to have somebody, at least either an overseeing producer or story editor or somebody who is able to say, okay, we need to. This is not what this character would say, or this is what we need to do with them, so that it stays on that path of being, rather than just a character that's just all over the map. Yeah. And I'm not saying that there aren't people that come across that way. So again, you can have a character and say, well, they're just the kind of person who just comes off totally different to different people. But you can just still do that in a way that seems realistic or seems right, as opposed to just, oh, well, the plot calls for the character doing this, so they're going to do this in this episode. I think with a lot of series that are more self-contained, that are kind of the episodic shows rather than continuing story, there's more of that because it's less important. They don't view it as, well, this character needs to stay consistent through a story arc. It's more just like, here's the plot of this episode, so this is what this character needs to do in this episode. And so there's less concern about that, which is why most of the time, I like that kind of show less, because I like consistency in characters and natural development over time, as opposed to just, well, the plot needs this character to suddenly be this, so now they are. I don't like that as much.
Right. Okay. One thing I can say about Doctor Who is that a lot of the writers were outside writers. They weren't on staff, and they were commissioned. And so they wouldn't have been aware of that season's stories, and so they wouldn't have known what the character were doing for that season. And they had long seasons in those, especially in like the 60s, like 36 episodes a season.
And usually very little budget and not much time. You know, they were told, oh, you got to finish this in a week, and you know, a lot of pressure.
And one more point as well is that a lot of the writers, because of the nature of the program, I think a lot of the writers would have been NTPs who are not necessarily the most interested in characterization.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you know, you and I have talked about that obviously when we did the Blake 7 reviews.
Yeah.
How, you know, as the show went on, they kind of lost some of that, and the characters went a bit loony in some ways. Because that's the other thing is, you know, actors, you know, if there's not somebody kind of holding down the fort, you know, so to speak, that actors can sometimes decide, oh, I want to do this with my character. And that was actually, you know, to bring it back to Homicide, you know, one of the issues with Melissa Leo and why she left the show is that she didn't like some of the things that they were writing for her character. And she had very strong ideas about this is how my character would behave. And so when she would get a script where, you know, this is not something I think Howard would do, she would go and say, I don't think this is right, you know. And so she developed a little bit of maybe a reputation with the producers of like being a little bit of a malcontent when it came to the storyline, because she always had a definite idea of this is what Kay Howard would do or not do. So you can have that happen too, where sometimes, you know, the actor is part of that. I mean, some, you know, when talked about like daytime soaps and stuff, they had to be part of the character development, or they, you know, it basically seemed one or the other. The longer running actors, it was very much, they put a lot of themselves into the character. This is how they're going to be, because they didn't have much time, kind of like with Doctor Who, you know, the same kind of pressure of we've got a short time to do this, and they got to do a lot of lines, and you've got to sort of be responsible for a lot of that characterization yourself as an actor. And then the ones that couldn't do that were replaced. So it was kind of as simple as that.
And with Kay Howard, Bradley, what happened is she got stuck in the office after being promoted. So it was, once you've done that, it's hard to work her into the plots.
All right, yeah.
Yeah, and that was part of the complaints when I mentioned earlier about like Homicide fans at the time. Kind of as the show went on, when they would push out older characters and try to focus too much time on the newer ones, was kind of the viewpoint. And I pretty much do agree with that. Even if I liked some of the new characters, I understand where that criticism comes from. But I also understand from the producers and you know, writers' point of view that they also wanted to do stuff that was fresh, and maybe they sometimes thought, well, there's not much we can do for this character. I know Andre Braugher thought that about Pimbleton. You know, he was going to leave the show after season 4, in fact, and they talked him into staying because they wrote the story of him having a stroke and everything that came from the aftermath of that, and that was interesting enough to him that he agreed to stay on the show. But he still got to a point at the end of season 6 where, you know, he was like, okay, I think I've you know, I've done enough with this character and I want to move on, kind of thing. So.
Right then. So, Jeff, can I give my score?
Go ahead.
All right then. So, all right then. Here we go. So, my score is 8 plus a couple of points there for that. So, grand total of 10.
2 whole points.
Yes, 2 whole
Wow.
points. That is my motivation. My instinct is out there for anyone interested in Enneagram.
Well, I will give it a 7 because I'm not as easily persuaded as Ben is by certain points. So.
Well, I have had a long wait for some decent talent in this show.
All right. I think I have to give it. I think probably a 7.5, mostly because, yeah, I mean, I also have to agree with the Jeff about the whole conclusion thing, which is very realistic, but sort of a little bit underwhelming because it's so realistic. So
Yeah.
yeah, but I think that's my only that and some of the character plot juggling I was unsure about, but other than that, I really enjoyed this part and both parts of the episode.
Yeah, I think I actually enjoyed it more this time around than when I watched it before. So, I mean, I might have even given it a lower score when I watched it. But I think, again, this may go some version tendencies, but I feel like when I'm watching something like this where we're doing the reviews and I'm kind of like watching it along with someone, I almost feel like, I don't know how to describe it, but I feel like it improves it when when it's a shared experience, and rather than me just watching it alone and by myself. So I think it's sort of, it just lends it to, and I think because I love the show so much overall that I want other people to like it, and so it kind of brings up my view of like watching it. I'm like in more of a positive attitude when I'm watching it myself, where I'm not being super critical. You know, if I was, I could find more stuff to pick at, but it's more like I kind of just let it entertain me, and if there's anything that really stands out as cringeworthy, then I'll say it. But there's not that many with Homicide. So, yeah, Ben mentioned something earlier. It's funny because I want to mention something else because we reviewed the whole Blake 7 series, and when we got to the final episode, that there was sort of a spoiler in the title because the final episode they called the episode Blake, but Ben pointed out, well, it's only you see Blake like only a few minutes into the show anyway, so it's not really that much of a spoiler because it's not like you would be in that suspense for very long anyway. So obviously Ben already looked at the title of the next story anyway. So but it's a similar situation, and then it doesn't take that long before he shows up. So anyway, join us next week for an episode called Kellerman PI.
Yep, I'll just stop it now, folks. That is a great title though, because it's like just after Magnum PI, which was a huge series in the 80s.